This podcast is intended for a mature audience over 19 years of age and is provided on an educational and informational basis. Any material presented is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as a substitute for professional medical advice or as an endorsement or medical claim by Pattison Media, Everything Podcasts, or any advertiser.
This is your brain.
Is recreational marijuana use bad for your brain?
So you know what cannabis does, but do you know why cannabis does what it does?
We make inner cannabis-like compounds. Our body recognizes these. It is not new to us.
Today on the Canadian Potcast, a doctor is taking us under the skull to reveal where all that THC and CBD is going and why it has the effects it does. With 16 years' experience working with cannabis, she's also going to tell us how the medical establishment struggles to use cannabis effectively and how she thinks the industry is evolving and adapting.
Those doctors, are not trained in it. They have no experience with it, so they're unable to help. And that's really where I'm finding that's the gap that needs to be filled.
But it's not just our own health that we need to think about when we think about cannabis. The pot industry isn't doing great at looking after the planet's health either. Head to your local pot shop and just try to find some flower that doesn't come in single-use plastic.
For every 1 gram of cannabis sold, there's about 50 grams of packaging.
We're reporting on the regulations that cause the cannabis industry's plastic problem and talking to some of the people trying to solve it. After the Pot News with Jay Coburn.
With the Pot News, I'm Jay Coburn. Licensed cannabis producers owed over $273 million in taxes at the end of last year, according to a report by MJ Biz Daily. That number is 72% higher than the year before. The Canada Revenue Agency says over 250 licensees were behind on their taxes. The CRA has been cracking down on unpaid taxes by cannabis producers. They've been forcing provincial wholesalers like the Ontario Cannabis Store to garnish payments from producers who are behind. In Manitoba, a cannabis advocacy organization is fighting the provincial ban on homegrown cannabis. The not-for-profit organization Tobagrown is appealing a court decision that upheld a provincial ban, saying the law infringes on federal jurisdiction and is unconstitutional. Manitoba's former Progressive Conservative government introduced the ban in 2018 with fines of over $2,500. The current NDP government has said it won't comment on ongoing litigation. And new research suggests that cannabis legalization has been associated with a decline in beer sales. A team from the Universities of Toronto and Manitoba and the Memorial University of Newfoundland found that non-medical cannabis legalization was associated with an immediate decline in beer sales, and that sales continued to decline each month after that. The researchers said they found modest but economically meaningful declines in the sales of canned and kegged beer, but they didn't identify a similar decline in the sales of either bottled beer or spirits. That's the Pot News. I'm Jay Coburn.
There are a lot of bold claims about cannabis's medicinal qualities. There's also a lot of scientific research to back them up. Well, to back some of it up. It's an emerging field that's been under research for decades because of prohibition. But we're talking to someone who's been working with medical cannabis for pretty much as long as anyone could have been.
My name's Bonni Goldstein. I'm a licensed physician in California, and I have been in the cannabis specialty now for about 16 years.
Dr. Goldstein doesn't just understand what cannabis does for her patients, she understands why it works. And because she's been working with it for 16 years, she's seen how the medical space is evolving and adapting to incorporate cannabis. Unfortunately, she says lots of doctors are struggling to catch up. She'll tell us in a bit why that is, but first we're going to find out what cannabis does in our bodies and what makes it so beneficial. And a reminder, we're just a podcast. Nothing in this show is medical advice. Everyone's body is different and reacts differently to different things. So if you've got a medical problem, speak to your doctor. Our producer, Karen Habashi, started asking Dr. Goldstein how she started specializing in cannabis.
So I've always been a science geek, intellectually curious, biology major, and very interested in physiology and chemistry. And so I start reading and I'm like, what is the endocannabinoid system? What is the system that they're talking about in these articles? And how come I don't know about it? So I started reading more and more, and I thought, holy cow, here we are as physicians, and we're ignoring this homeostatic regulating system that can be used as a therapeutic target. So that's what really made me so curious about it and made me go down that path. I thought, here is this plant that's been villainized and characterized as a bad drug, yet why would I ignore it when there's some science behind it?
Do you think with cannabis becoming more legal and there's more awareness and education around it, do you think medical schools are going to start implementing the endocannabinoid system in their teachings?
So the short answer is yes. I do think we can no longer ignore it. And look, I've been doing this now 16 years, since 2008. So I'm seeing the evolution and I'm experiencing it on the front lines. And more people are reporting, our doctor recommended for us to come see you. Or, I asked my doctor, what's an alternative to opioids? And so they are getting some advice, but unfortunately, those doctors, are not trained in it. They have no experience with it, so they're unable to help. And that's really where I'm finding that's the gap that needs to be filled, is that education. And I am working on that with a new company. I just brought on a new doctor and I'm mentoring her. And what's interesting is after about the third or fourth patient, she said, I'm learning a whole new specialty. And that's daunting for doctors. We work so hard, 4 years of medical school, then internship and residency, often a fellowship. Who wants to learn a whole new specialty? I think that those of us who have been in the field and helping people have to help lead the way. So that's one of my goals over the next couple of years, is to educate physicians. And I'm working on a new business where it's really just education based so that it makes it quick and easy. I'm self-taught. I had to spend nights reading articles and trying to look for the little nuggets and then deal with patients and get their feedback. Yes, okay, I've got all that. I understand it now, my 10,000 hours plus, but I want to try to make it so that doctors don't see this big mountain of how am I going to learn about this? Because really, I want my oncologist to be reading about oncology, and I want my pain management doctor to know everything about all those medicines. But it would be nice too if they had some idea of cannabinoid medicine and what it can do in various specialties. We are headed towards federal, in the United States anyway, federal legalization. I don't know what that's going to look like, but certainly it's going to probably open the door for physicians to be a little more accepting, because many doctors are not really excited about dealing with something that's federally illegal. And I don't blame them. We work hard for our licenses, and there's always that fear that someone can take your license away.
As someone who's a post-double lung transplant, I used cannabis pre-transplant. And then after that, I talked to the doctors and they were like, there isn't enough research done on the medications, on their interactions with the grafts and everything. And I think that when the medical universities start enabling doctors to learn about the endocannabinoid system and pharmacists and more to be issued, I think this will help further decreasing wrong use of cannabis. But I also wanted to ask you, if someone came to you and told you I'm on those meds, would you say to someone, well, cannabis doesn't work for you?
Before anybody can come see me, they have to submit medical records so I can see what their diagnosis is. And I also ask for a list of current medications. So I have a list of previous medications and the reason why they didn't work for them or why they were taken off of them. That's always helpful as well. But I'll give you a very recent example. There was a child, just almost a teenager, with stage 4 Ewing sarcoma, which is bone cancer, and it's spreading, but they're not getting anywhere. They've been fighting for a number of years. And she was on a drug called sirolimus. It's an immunosuppressant that's often used in transplant, but it's also sometimes used in cancer. And when they submitted their records, I said, nope, I am not putting the two together. You cannot add cannabis to sirolimus because there are documented side effects that include some pretty severe stuff, including some neuropsychiatric problems, confusion, delirium. And the Parents actually reported back that they were thinking about stopping the sirolimus anyway. She had been on it for a while. It didn't seem to be helping. And if she went off of it, then potentially would I accept her? So I'm very clear. I am not going to put a patient at risk, right? And so there's some cancer immunotherapies that at this point I will not combine because there's a little bit of evidence coming out of some Israeli research that some of the cancer immunotherapies and cannabinoids may actually affect time to tumor progression and overall survival. Do no harm, right? So if I know about it ahead of time, of course, I'm going to try to avoid it. We know the number one drug interaction that we really worry about is warfarin or Coumadin, which is a blood thinner. Luckily, most people have kind of moved on to the other type of anticoagulants, but still people on warfarin or Coumadin can have bleeding issues. There's a number of case reports, and what happens is that CBD especially, but it's also been described with THC, so both of them, and not in high doses, doesn't have to be a super high dose, can make warfarin hang around your body longer. And when it hangs around longer, you have more bleeding issues. You have to be very attentive to this. How many people are walking into a dispensary and buying cannabis without knowing these drug interactions, and where are they supposed to get this information? And that's why the key is education. People have to know, right? In the same way we all kind of hear about don't take too much Tylenol because it can harm your liver. I think a lot of people are aware of that. So I think we have to get the word out on these potential drug interactions.
Yeah, like on the back of the packaging for cannabis, if you take this and this and this.
Yeah, or even in the dispensary. Here's a list of medications. If you're on these medications, please talk to a physician before you would take cannabis. It's very important to know. And this is why we need research. This is why we need to make sure that we allow physicians, scientists, researchers to proceed forward with research. And I always think to myself, so prohibition on research, who does that serve, right? And that doesn't really serve anybody very well. Maybe pharmaceutical companies, because if you don't know about cannabis, then you might say, oh, well, then I'll be reluctant to use it. But at the same time, an herbalist many years ago, she said, we are not too stupid to understand this plant. The plant does so many things. So people always ask, how is it possible? And remember, it all goes back down to where do those compounds in the plant, how do they interact in the brain and body? And part of it is the endocannabinoid system, of course. And what people must realize is we make inner cannabis-like compounds. Our body recognizes these. It is not new to us. And so the plant compounds, what we call phyto, phytocannabinoids, can substitute for those compounds that we make. And there's been some evidence to show that people with migraines may have an endocannabinoid deficiency or dysfunction. And remember, the reason we have these endocannabinoids is to help keep the brain in balance so it's not overly excited. You shouldn't feel like a bear is chasing you in the woods every minute of every day of your life. And that's what a lot of these neuroexcitatory conditions are. What is pain? Pain is an over message. What's nausea? An over message. Yes, in response to something. But at the same time, if your body's endocannabinoid system, which exists to help rein in those overexcited messages, is overworked or not working very well, how can you help it work better? How can you use this already existing physiologic regulator? Well, you augment with those outside source of the cannabinoid. And remember, too, that these cannabinoids are not just interacting with the endocannabinoid system. They interact with a whole slew of other targets, what's called TRP receptors, which are involved in pain and inflammation and cancer. It's kind of amazing. And that is why there are so many different, and I will flat out say, it's not a panacea for everything. If you have really high blood pressure, take your blood pressure medicine. My father is going to be 94. He's alive because he takes his heart medicine. But I also give him cannabis to help with quality of life issues so he can sleep at night. So it's very important to understand that this is a survival mechanism. That's what the endocannabinoid system is. And if it's not functioning properly, no other drug addresses it. Cannabis can give us what addresses it. And it's not always perfect, and I don't claim it to be perfect, but it doesn't have to be perfect. No drug is perfect.
That was Dr. Bonni Goldstein talking to our producer, Karen Habashi.
8 million metric tons of plastic trash enters the sea from land every year. The equivalent of 5 plastic bags filled with trash for every foot of coastline in the world.
Cannabis had a plastic problem long before it was legalized. The Ziploc baggie full of bud isn't anyone's idea of sustainability. But legal cannabis still mostly comes packaged inside a lot of plastic. Too much plastic, if you ask Corey Saban.
For every 1 gram of cannabis sold, there's about 50 grams of packaging to support that 1 gram.
Corey is the CEO and founder of Rewaste, a plastic recycling company based in Edmonton. A lot of his business comes from cannabis. In fact, Rewaste has a dedicated cannabis packaging recycling program. Because it turns out the cannabis doesn't just create a lot of plastic, it's plastic that's difficult to recycle too. Our reporter Jay Coburn is here with the story.
I started thinking about this story when I went into the pot shop just down the road from my apartment. I was looking at this beautiful, carefully crafted display behind some glass, all these different types of flour, edibles, oils, vape cartridges. But it wasn't the product and the experience I was thinking about. It was where all that packaging might end up. The ocean.
Cannabis packaging is horrible. In a word, why is it that way?
Myrna Gillis, the CEO of Aqualitas, taking the words right out of my mouth there. Aqualitas are a licensed cannabis producer in Nova Scotia.
We make our home on the ocean here in Atlantic Canada. Our facility is literally meters away from the Atlantic Ocean.
I contacted Aqualitas because they're a cannabis producer that, like me, thinks about the ocean.
We grow using aquaponics, which is using live fish that are in recirculating tanks, and we use living soil, and the water from those tanks and the outputs from the fish are used to fertilize our plants.
But even Aqualitas uses plastic for their packaging. I'll talk more about that in a bit because they're actually doing something really cool there. But I wanted to know why almost all cannabis comes packed in a lot of plastic.
First thing is that the regulator required a certain type of packaging.
That regulator is Health Canada. The regulations are the Cannabis Act. The requirements for cannabis packaging are really strict. You can't depict people or animals. You can't have anything that evokes a glamorous, exciting, or really any positive emotion about a certain way of life.
So they required child-proof packaging, which obviously has a different sort of robustness about it. It required certain messages and things on the labels.
You also can't have anything that associates the product with negative emotions in a way of life. You can't have fluorescent colors. You can't have some shades of yellow or red. It has to be opaque or at least translucent. Really, it's easier to list what is allowed than what isn't. Knowing all that, though, surely most, if not all of this could be achieved with opaque glass, for example. I've seen a few producers using that, so why isn't glass more common?
Some people stay away from glass because of the weight for shipping or because of breakability, so you do have those components. When you talk about things like a tin can or a carry case that you might traditionally think of, they may not be childproof. They also need to be odor resistant.
So we've got this checklist of odor resistant, durable, childproof, not transparent, and finally, economical. You end up with plastic. And I have seen some clever attempts to use other materials. I bought a pre-roll that came in a ceramic tube recently, but that tube was still wrapped in a second layer of plastic. It sounds like that producer may have encountered something similar to Aqualitas.
It was very frustrating. We had a package that we thought certainly met all of the childproofing requirements, but we actually had to put it in a secondary package to say that it was odor-proof as well.
I might have stopped trying to hide the smell of cannabis from my parents, but instead we're hiding it from Health Canada. There are regulations around labels too that make trying out new types of packaging difficult. Things like THC content and the packing date have to be included on there, but also recommended storage conditions and the license holder's contact details. They all have to be included, and they all have to be at least a minimum font size. Transparency in what you're buying isn't a bad thing. We need to know what we're consuming. And the regulations are pretty restrictive in how they're displayed.
You absolutely need to have the information there, but maybe there's a different way that we can deliver it that has a smaller footprint and that people could access it differently.
Producers also don't want to risk their product being thrown out because the label falls off. Here's Corey Saban again.
These labels are just adhered with such a strong adhesive that it can't be treated like traditional plastic with labels through a normal process.
A label also has to include "keep out of reach of children," all capitals. It's worth remembering at this point that to even get inside a cannabis store, you have to show ID proving you're of legal age. That's a good thing. One of the goals of legalization was to regulate the market and make it harder for people under the legal age to access cannabis. So Health Canada's regulations are designed to protect children in case they find some cannabis that perhaps a parent brought home or someone careless left on the street. But it's not like you can force people to keep their cannabis inside the original container once it's out of the shop.
I don't think anyone is taking a plastic container with a child-proof cap and, that's how they store it at home. Most people will still throw a Bovita or put it in a glass jar or put it somewhere, to give it some more longevity when it comes certainly to flower.
At this point, you might be listening and thinking, well, I throw my packaging in the recycling. Well, Corey Saban from Rewaste says that doesn't necessarily mean it ends up being recycled.
If we look at the infrastructure set up to recycle all of this packaging, it all falls through that first step of a material recovery facility, which is a shaker screen, that all the materials will go across. Anything the size of the palm of your hand or a coffee cup lid will fall through that shaker screen. That then is sent to landfill. So just due to the size of the packaging, it's not recyclable.
Myrna Gillis says that one way to reduce the amount of plastic waste is to reduce the amount of packets that people buy in the first place. Edibles, for example, are limited to 10 milligrams of THC per pack. But you can buy a few packs at once if your tolerance is high.
The idea of 10 milligrams of an edible, intuitively that format is not consumed in the legacy market or anywhere else in the legal cannabis world, like if you look to the US. So that's a very low-hanging fruit, is to simply allow for more units in a package so that in the ratio of the content of the package, you're not filled with headspace and air and just pure wastes.
Myrna says we could also get more creative in the ways that all that label information is given to consumers.
We can't have, for example, a QR code. You could communicate all of that information in a QR code. And so you could have a smaller level of packaging so that you're still completely compliant.
Corey Saban wants to see the regulator encourage producers to use recycled plastics produced in Canada, because that might keep costs down and make greener options more attractive, both to producers and consumers.
I think what I'd like to see Health Canada do is look at the existing regulation regarding packaging. Look to see where packaging is coming from now. Oftentimes it's coming from overseas. I think Health Canada has an opportunity to get involved, not just from the regulation perspective, because that's very regulated right now. But I think they have an opportunity to say, let's look at the domestic opportunities within Canada. Who is producing packaging domestically so that collectively we can help businesses introduce lower GHGs to their procurement, because domestic options do exist.
Changes in the law don't happen quickly though, if they happen at all. So Aqualitas are changing the way cannabis is packaged without waiting. Like I said earlier, Aqualitas cares about the ocean and they care about plastic waste. So instead of producing plastic that might end up in the ocean, they use plastic that's already been in the ocean. They do that by working with an American company, Sana Packaging.
We contacted them and we said, look, we want to bring something to Canada that's not here. And we know we got to go through a lot of regulatory hurdles and time, but we're committed.
Sana Packaging is based in Colorado, and they reclaim food-grade plastics from the ocean so that Aqualitas and other cannabis companies can turn them into new packaging.
These are plastics that are gathered either from feeding sources of water into oceans or from the ocean itself. And then they take it, they grade it, they break it into these little bio beads effectively, and then they can be made into packaging. We've taken over 80,000 pounds of waste from waterways with our own packaging.
And this, to me, seems like a great idea. But when I asked Myrna about how they got the packaging to market, I could see why they were the first.
It took us almost 2 years to get this product to market because we had to go through all of the studies, all the child-proofing. We had to go through all the food grade verifications that it doesn't leach, it doesn't do any of the things that you would want to make sure that it's safe. Children can't open it, it makes the child-proof. We had 200 kids with tiny little hands and all of the things that you would do to make that work. And we worked with our regulator. We were back and forth because we were forging a new trail here. And we're not the only ones, but we feel really good, the fact that other people have decided to join that movement because it's part of the solution.
In a saturated cannabis market where producers are going out of business, I can totally see why this kind of R&D process might be out of reach for a lot of companies. Once you've got your cannabis in its shiny plastic packaging though, reclaimed or not, you still need to get rid of it eventually. And remember, Corey told us that recycling plants can't always handle cannabis plastic. But he has a solution. ReWaste has a dedicated cannabis packaging recycling program. And if you're in Alberta or Southern Ontario, you might be near a drop-off point. Look out for a white box with green text labeled ReWaste in your local pot shop. You can also go to ReWaste's website to see where these boxes are.
Consumers and employees will come back and deposit their packaging into those bins. Once that bin fills up, then we have the contents transferred to a shipping box, and a courier will go right to their door, pick up the box, and send that right to ReWaste.
ReWaste then takes that packaging and turns it into plastic shavings, which are molded into new cannabis packaging. Corey says that normally 5 to 10% of cannabis packaging is recycled. With ReWaste, it's more like 95%. And if you want to buy cannabis that's already packed in recycled plastic, then Aqualitas brands are a good start. Reef Organic's one of them.
The consumers make the choices and they choose the brands and companies that they wish to support. And what I would say is that if these things are important to you, then you need to support companies like ours and other people that are doing this work, because for the sake of $1 or $2 a gram of product, what really matters to you, and do you want to support companies that have literally put their money where their mouth is?
So next time I head into the pot shop and look at that display full of plastic, maybe I'll look at it a little differently. Maybe I'll see what Corey sees.
I see opportunity. I see the ability to do something more with all of the packaging. I think what it shows me is there's still a massive problem out there that needs to be solved. So when I see a wall full of the packaging, I just see it as an opportunity to continue to work with the industry and develop solutions.
Thanks to Jay Coburn for that report, and thanks for listening to the Canadian Potcast. I hope you'll join us for the next episode of the Canadian Potcast. Hit the subscribe or follow button to make sure you do. And while you wait for the next episode, check out westernbuzz.ca. The Canadian Potcast is an Everything Podcasts production in partnership with Pattison Media. The opinions expressed in this podcast are not necessarily the views of the podcast team or our partners, and this show is intended for a 19-plus audience. Thanks to Creative Director Cliff Dumas, Showrunner Karen Habashi, Senior Writer Jay Coburn, and our Sound Engineer John Massacre. Thanks for listening to the Canadian Potcast, your authority on cannabis in Canada. I'm Don Schaefer. Another Everything Podcast production. Visit everythingpodcast.com, a division of Pattison Media. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast.